Chapter 23. The Christians and the Roman Power, from Caracalla to Philip. Caracalla, who had plotted against his father's life and had been forgiven, an instance of mercy, it is said, more fatal to the empire than a long series of cruelties, soon succeeded in getting rid of his brother Geta, to whom from childhood he had been a mortal enemy. In an apartment in which the widow of Severus had arranged for the meeting and reconciliation of her two sons, seemingly with the hearty concurrence of both, the elder, Caracalla, caused the younger to be assassinated in her presence. He was covered with his blood. The eminent lawyer Papinian, Praetorian prefect, was commanded to write an apology for the monstrous deed. "It is easier to commit a parricide than to justify one," was Papinian's reply, for which he was put to death. As he had abundant reason to anticipate the penalty, we may regret that his fidelity to his principles was not hallowed by Christianity, but we cannot refuse to acknowledge it as a proof that in the heathen world God had not left himself without witness in man's moral nature as well as in the outward universe. Another eminent personage was put to death for a witticism. He had suggested that the emperor, who took the names of several conquered nations, should add the title of Geticus. 20,000 persons perished in a proscription as friends of Geta, and soon the rapine and savage cruelty of this fratricide wasted the remotest provinces and made his name more detestable than that of Nero. But, as was the case with so many of the worst emperors, he did not turn his fury against the Christians. Tertullian, who is the authority for the statement that Severus kept in the palace a Christian who had once wrought a cure on him, tells us that Caracalla's nurse had likewise belonged to the church, and to this he ascribes the circumstance that the persecutions gradually ceased under his reign. But though the Christians were spared as such, it is not easy to admire Tertullian's words as applied to such a savage tyrant, lacte Christiano educatus, brought up on the milk of Christianity. This emperor, who had as much of the milk of the wolf in his veins as any man who had reigned in Rome from the days of Romulus, was assassinated when he was on a pilgrimage to the famous Temple of the Moon at Carrhae. Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect, who, to save his own life, had instigated the murder, succeeded, and during his short reign of 14 or 18 months, likewise left the Christians in peace. He is even said to have issued an edict forbidding that anyone should be condemned for the crime of despising the gods. Like his predecessor and so many others who had ruled from the days of Julius, Macrinus died a violent death in consequence of dissatisfaction among the troops. He was succeeded by a sovereign who furnishes perhaps the most odious example of precocious wickedness known in history. His original name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but he is commonly known by the name of Heliogabalus. He took, moreover, the titles of Augustus and Antoninus. The reign of his youth, which began when he was 14 years of age and ended within 4 years, presents an unparalleled union of fantastic folly, fanatic superstition, and bestial indecency. Had he been satisfied, says Professor Ramsay, with supping on the tongues of peacocks and nightingales, with feeding lions on pheasants and parrots, with assembling companies of guests who were all fat, or all lean, or all tall, or all short, or all bald, or all gouty, and regaling them with mock repasts, had he been content to occupy his leisure hours in solemnizing the nuptials of his favourite deity with the Trojan Pallas or the African Urania, and in making matches between the gods and goddesses all over Italy, men might have laughed good-naturedly, anticipating an increase of wisdom with increasing years. But, unhappily, even these trivial amusements were not unfrequently accompanied with cruelty and bloodshed. The Roman populace would, with easy toleration, have admitted and worshipped a new divinity, but they beheld with disgust their emperor appearing in public, arrayed in the attire of a Syrian priest, dancing wild measures and chanting barbaric hymns. They listened with horror to the tales of magic rites and of human victims secretly slaughtered. They could scarcely submit without indignation to the ordinance that an outlandish idol should take precedence of their fathers' gods, and of Jupiter himself, and still less could they consent to obey the decree subsequently promulgated that it should not be lawful to offer homage at Rome to any other celestial power. The blackest of his offences, however, are too horrible and too disgusting to admit of description. He instituted a Senate of Ladies, which was presided over by his mother, Julia Somaeus, and legislated on questions of fashion. He had brought to Rome the black stone in which the sun god was adored at Emesa, and when the magnificent temple in which it was set was consecrated, human victims were offered in sacrifice. According to the testimony of a heathen writer, Lampridius, this must have been before the promulgation of the decree spoken of by Professor Ramsay, he had conceived the design of fusing the Jewish, Samaritan, and Christian religions into one, putting himself at the head of the worshippers as their high priest. At all events, the fury of this obscene savage was not turned against the Christians, and moreover, it cannot be doubted that, by his introduction of those foreign rites, he struck as fatal a blow at the old state religion as it had ever sustained. He was a base instrument used by Providence in preparing for the great victory of the cross, which was to be achieved within a century after his death. He too was murdered in a rising of the soldiers. His corpse was beheaded, dragged through the streets, and cast into the Tiber, and in bitter scorn the people gave him the posthumous nickname of Tiberinus. In the year 222 AD, the Roman Empire was once more governed by a noble and illustrious man, Alexander Severus, the cousin of Heliogabalus. He cleansed the court, which had become a cage of foul birds, honoured the Senate, which his predecessor had brought into contempt, and, which was probably most difficult of all, restored discipline in the army. He too was noted for his syncretism in religion. In his lararium, or domestic chapel, there stood, along with the family gods, the images of Orpheus and Apollonius, and Absalom and Christ. It is manifest from this that, when it is reported of him, as it is on good authority, that he intended to erect a temple to Christ, we cannot conclude that he had any clear conception of what Christ is to his followers, but merely that he considered him entitled to public worship along with other divinities. The great principle of Christian morals, whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, do ye even so unto them, he caused to be written on the walls of his palace and of other public buildings, and he was frequently heard repeating it. He had probably learned it from his mother Mamaea, who, when at Antioch, had sent for the great Origen and conversed with him on Christianity. That the attachment of the emperor to the new religion, however, was not profound is evident, it is said, from the fact that, in the collection of laws published at his decree by his friend Ulpian, the rescripts of former emperors against the Christians were retained, but they could not have been rigidly enforced, for about this time Christian churches were erected in different places. The Thracian Maximin, by whom Alexander Severus was murdered and who succeeded to the empire, 235 AD, persecuted the Christians, from hatred, it is said, more of his predecessor than of them. But in Pontus and Cappadocia there had been devastating earthquakes, by which, as so often before, the rage of the populace had been inflamed against the atheists, though that was a name for the followers of Christ which was going out of use. To this reign is frequently, though not always, assigned the legend of Ursula, which, when assailed unmercifully by the first Protestant historians, was honoured with an entire folio dedicated to its defence by the Jesuit Father Crombach. The legend cannot be traced further back than 1100 AD. Ursula, daughter of the British king Deonatus, was sought in marriage by a heathen prince, Holofernes, and agreed to accept him on the two conditions that he should become a Christian, and that she should be allowed 3 years to make a pilgrimage to Rome with her maidens. Including herself, the travellers were 11 in number, and each was attended by 1,000 companions, who were gathered from all parts of the world. On their way home, they were massacred by Huns at Cologne. The Huns were immediately afterwards, on the prey of the martyrs, smitten by a host of angels, and the inhabitants of Cologne, grateful to the 11,000 intercessors to whom they owed their deliverance, erected a church in their honour on the spot where there still stands a church known by the name of St. Ursula. Roman Catholic writers now admit that the legend contains embellishment and exaggeration. They admit, for instance, that the number is improbable, and that it may have originated in the misinterpretation of undecim MVs, M signifying not millia, but martyres. The companions are sometimes reduced to one, Ursia et undecimilla. The persecutions under Maximin the Thracian were partial in extent, being waged chiefly in Cappadocia and Pontus, where the proconsul Serenianus is named as being harsh and violent in the administration of the old laws. In the other parts of the empire, the Christians enjoyed tranquillity, which was continued under the two following emperors, Gordianus, 238 to 244 AD, and Philip the Arabian, 244 to 249 AD. The latter, indeed, was so far from being a persecutor that legend, exaggerating in a way of which we have had similar instances, represented him as actually a Christian. According to Eusebius, Book 6, Chapter 34, he desired to take part in the sacred services of the Christians on the night before Easter, but the bishop of the community, showing a fidelity and courage of which there were afterwards well-accredited examples both in the West and in the East, declared to him, probably with reference to the murder of Gordian, that, on account of the load of guilt which lay upon him, he could not be permitted to take part in the celebration unless he did penance, to which, it is stated, the emperor willingly submitted. The utmost that can be established, however, is that Philip showed himself favourable to the Christians, and it may be conjectured that his religious principles were, like those of Alexander Severus and others, of an eclectic character, which of course might easily give occasion to misunderstanding. From the language of Origen in his writing against Celsus, we learn that at this period, though it cannot be said that any emperor had yet been converted, the leaven had been spreading far and wide and had reached classes which formerly, with few individual exceptions, had been hostile and indifferent. He admits that in the last times the number might easily be counted of those who had sealed their testimony with their blood, that God in his mercy had prevented a war of extermination. He speaks of the rapid increase in the numbers of the Christians, and of the boldness and publicity with which they declare themselves and celebrate their worship. They were now no longer a despised Jewish sect, but a religious communion which could come forward as a considerable society, including now, as could not be said at any previous period, many of the rich and wise and mighty. And while men in high position and office belonged to the church, Christian teachers now stood in honour not with a few of those who remained without. But while he predicts the fall of the old religion and the triumph of the new, he seeks to warn his brethren in the faith against a sifting persecution which he sees approaching. The comparative rest which had been enjoyed for so long a time will be succeeded by a new outburst of violence, as soon as the calumniators of Christianity had spread the opinion that the cause of the many revolts which took place in the emperor's last years was the great multitude of Christians, who had grown so rapidly just because the persecutions had been interrupted. He was not apprehensive that the calumnies of the past, the athiotis, the theastia nipna, the idiopodi mixis, would be renewed, but the great tranquillity which had been enjoyed, with but local interruptions, from the days of Septimius Severus, the time at which the followers of Christ ventured to erect buildings for their worship, resembled, in his view, a sky that was not only serene but subtle, and in which the clouds would soon gather and burst in pitiless storm. The indications of the approaching day when the gospel would gain its great temporal triumph might well inspire the fear that the enemy would come anew with great wrath. The long repose had led to such an increase of members that, if paganism was not to succumb without a struggle, persecution might be dreaded. There is a second remark to be made here. The long repose had proved so relaxing that, according to the testimony of Christian writers themselves, persecution was needed. Already in the time of Tertullian, who died before the accession of Alexander Severus, the custom of buying off persecution had become common, a custom which, it is needless to say, he denounced in no measured terms, and which was indeed calculated to prove a most serious stumbling block. There is no possibility, at least, of defending the libellous if, as there can be no reasonable doubt was the case, the document so-called asserted or implied that the holder of it had offered sacrifice and was consequently exempt from the penalty of the law. These libelli might be issued, and were issued in great number, where there was no general or violent persecution. The imperial rescripts remaining unrepealed, a magistrate had only to write out an order that certain suspected persons, who were designated by name, should offer sacrifice to the gods, and thus give evidence that they were not Christians, but loyal subjects of the empire, and the Christians challenged, if they were not disposed to make open denial of their faith, had the alternative of intimating, and this was frequently all that was wanted, that they were prepared to pay a sum of money if left in the free exercise of their own religion. In return they received these certificates, which could not possibly be a formal dispensation, and which no magistrate had it in his power to grant, but, as is both probable in itself, and confirmed by ancient testimony, a virtual declaration at least that they were not Christians. There were disciplinarians in the church who contended that the guilt of the libellatici was as great as that of the sacrificati and the thurificati, those who sacrificed, and that, if they were to get absolution on earth at all, neither class should receive it except in the case of the immediate prospect of death. But other proofs were not a-wanting that the long repose had become, as it was expressed, a Capua to those who should have endured hardness as good soldiers of Jesus Christ. Blunt has condensed in one passage a variety of particulars, collected from different writings of Cyprian's. Though the number of the Christians was now very great, and though many among them were of an affluent class, so that at Rome even senators and knights, chief men and matrons, were found in their ranks, and accordingly, though living to themselves and thereby escaping the pollution which followed from intercourse with the heathen was now more practicable, we discover them resorting to heathen courts, becoming members as servants of heathen households, forming heathen marriages, frequenting heathen spectacles, and even defending the practice, alleging that in Scripture Elijah is spoken of as the charioteer of Israel and David represented as dancing before the ark, that even there we read of harps and cymbals and pipes, that the apostle talks of wrestling against spiritual wickedness, of running a race, of winning a crown, that a Christian, such was the notable argument, might surely behold what Scripture describes. Moreover, we find Christian women adorning themselves with the most costly decorations, virgins taking part in nuptial revels, and even resorting to baths frequented by both sexes, bishops of the church abandoning their chairs, deserting their people, wandering through distant provinces, hunting after gain, possessing themselves of funds by fraudulent means, and swelling their amount by usurious practices. No wonder that God, while watching over his church, should see fit to administer a sharp correction for abuses like these. But while these abuses existed and needed correction, we should probably err greatly if we inferred that the majority of Christians had fallen away in any lamentable degree from primitive love and purity and zeal. At all events, the Capua was not followed by ruinous disaster, but by purifying struggle and suffering, which were preparatory to final triumph.